A single white streak cuts through gray water, and a warship built to fight other warships breaks apart in minutes, killed by an enemy no lookout ever saw. In an instant, centuries of naval doctrine built on gun ranges, battle lines, and visible foes became obsolete. For Britain, an island fed and fueled entirely by ships, the arithmetic was brutal. Sink enough merchant tonnage, and the war ends without a single soldier landing on English soil. What followed was the longest continuous campaign of both world wars, a 40-year arms race fought in absolute darkness, from crude petrol-driven submersibles and improvised hydrophones to wolfpacks coordinated by radio across 1,000 miles of open ocean, answered by radar, codebreakers, escort carriers, and destroyers built by the hundred. Thousands of merchant sailors and 3 out of 4 German submariners would never come home. This is the story of how navies learned to hunt what they could not see, and what that lesson cost. At 20 minutes to 4 on the afternoon of the 5th of September 1914, the British scout cruiser HMS Pathfinder was steaming at a leisurely 5 knots off St. Abb's Head on the eastern approaches to the Firth of Forth. She was low on coal, which was why she moved so slowly, and her lookouts were scanning the gray water for the things they had been trained to see: smoke on the horizon, the silhouette of a raider, the wake of a torpedo boat. What they were not looking for, because almost nobody in the Royal Navy yet believed it was possible in open water, was a thin steel tube the width of a periscope lens standing perhaps a foot above the swell, some 2,000 yards off the starboard bow. Behind that lens was Captain Lieutenant Otto Hersing, commanding the submarine U-21. He had been stalking the cruiser for the better part of an hour. He fired 1 torpedo. The weapon struck beneath the bridge and detonated against the forward magazine. Pathfinder's bow was blown apart. Ready ammunition ignited in a chain of secondary explosions that tore the ship open from the inside, and the mast collapsed across the wreckage of the forecastle. Fishermen watching from the Berwickshire coast saw a column of smoke and assumed a mine. Within 4 minutes, the cruiser was gone. Of a complement of around 268 officers and ratings, roughly 259 were killed. Bodies and debris washed ashore for days afterward. It was the first warship in history sunk by a torpedo fired from a modern submarine at sea, and the entire engagement had lasted less time than it takes to boil a kettle. Nothing in 3 centuries of naval thought had prepared the men on that bridge for what killed them. British sea power had been built on lines of battle, on gunnery ranges measured in thousands of yards, on the assumption that an enemy who wished to sink you must first allow you to see him. Admirals had spent the previous decade arguing about turret arrangements and armor belts and the coming clash of dreadnoughts in the North Sea. The submarine, where it was considered at all, was widely dismissed as a coast defense curiosity, useful for harbor work, unsuited to blue water, and in the opinion of more than one senior officer, faintly dishonorable. Pathfinder's destruction demolished that comfortable consensus in 4 minutes. A vessel that cost a fraction of a cruiser, crewed by fewer than 30 men, had erased a warship and her company without ever exposing herself to a single shot. 17 days later, the lesson was repeated on a scale that could not be explained away. 3 elderly armored cruisers, Aboukir, Hogue, and Cressy, were patrolling an area of the southern North Sea known as the Broad 14s off the Dutch coast. Junior officers had already nicknamed the formation the Live Bait Squadron. At 6:30 in the morning on the 22nd of September, Aboukir was hit and began to capsize. Her captain's companions, believing she had struck a mine, closed into lower boats and rescue survivors. Hogue was torpedoed as she stopped in the water. Cressy, closing on the wreckage, was hit twice. All three were sunk by a single submarine, U-9, commanded by Otto Weddigen in roughly 90 minutes. 1,459 British sailors died, many of them reservists and cadets barely into their teens. In a single morning, the Royal Navy lost more men than Nelson had lost in his entire career. The immediate consequence was not merely tactical but psychological. Fleet anchorages that had been considered secure were suddenly suspect. The Grand Fleet abandoned Scapa Flow for weeks and dispersed to Ireland and the west coast of Scotland while defenses were built, an episode the Navy privately called periscopitis, the epidemic of imagined sightings, the destroyers firing at porpoises and floating timber, the battleships zigzagging away from shadows. Officers who had trained their whole lives to bring guns to bear on a visible enemy now confronted an opponent that could choose the time and place of every engagement, strike without warning, and vanish. It was the beginning of a permanent change in the emotional climate of naval service. From that autumn onward, every convoy escort's watch in 2 world wars would be haunted by the same question the men aboard Pathfinder 3, the same calculation returned in the North Atlantic, where wolfpacks of 20 and 30 boats fought convoys across the mid-ocean air gap and sank ships faster than the shipyards of the world could replace them. Across the 2 conflicts, German submarines sank in the region of 5,000 merchant vessels in the First World War and nearly 3,000 in the Second, a combined total of more than 25 million tons of shipping and tens of thousands of merchant seamen dead. The counter-effort was equally enormous and equally costly. Of roughly 1,150 U-boats commissioned by the German Navy between 1935 and 1945, some 785 were destroyed. Of about 40,000 men who served in the submarine arm, close to 30,000 never came home, the highest loss rate of any major fighting service in the war. The destroyers, corvettes, frigates, sloops, and escort carriers that killed them were the product of an industrial and scientific mobilization that stretched from Liverpool control rooms to Canadian shipyards to physics laboratories in Cambridge and Washington, and their crews paid their own price in the freezing water between Newfoundland and Iceland. This is the story of that duel, from the first crude hand-cranked craft that tried to sink wooden ships with gunpowder, through the diesel-electric raiders of 1914, the wolfpacks and convoy battles of the Atlantic, the invention of ASDIC and radar, and the hunting techniques that turned the hunters into the hunted, to the last, desperate German boats designed to stay submerged forever. It is a continuous escalation with no natural pause, one side always a step from ruin, the other always a season from victory, played out in the dark, cold water beneath the world's shipping lanes. It began with a single torpedo and a cruiser that sank in 4 minutes. On the 14th of December 1906, at the Germania Werft yard in Kiel, the Imperial German Navy commissioned its first submarine. She was called simply U-1, a 238-ton craft with a single bow torpedo tube, a crew of 22, and a pair of kerosene engines that trailed a plume of white vapor across the water and made the boat visible for miles. She could manage about 10.5 knots on the surface and rather less than 9 submerged, and she could stay under for barely a couple of hours before her air fouled and her batteries died. Germany was the last of the great naval powers to build one. Britain had commissioned its first 5 years earlier, France and the United States earlier still, and Admiral von Tirpitz, the architect of the German battle fleet, had regarded the whole enterprise as a distraction from the business of building dreadnoughts. In the calculations of 1906, U-1 was a curiosity. Within a decade, her descendants would come closer to defeating the British Empire than any German battleship ever did. The technology matured with startling speed. The decisive step came with the adoption of the diesel engine, which burned a safer fuel, produced no telltale exhaust haze, and radically extended a boat's endurance. With the U-19 class laid down in 1911 and entering service in 1913, Germany had vessels of some 650 tons surfaced, twin diesels, 4 torpedo tubes, a deck gun, and a cruising radius of 5,000 nautical miles or more. These were no longer harbor defense machines. They were ocean-going raiders, capable of operating for weeks off the Scottish coast, in the Irish Sea, or in the western approaches, and returning to Wilhelmshaven under their own power. Germany went to war in August 1914 with roughly 28 submarines commissioned, of which perhaps 20 were fit for frontline patrol. It was a smaller force than Britain's. It was also, boat for boat, the most modern in the world. Almost nobody in a position of authority believed it mattered. The prevailing doctrine in every admiralty held that submarines were auxiliaries, useful for defending harbors and ambushing blockading squadrons, unsuited to independent campaigning. The first Sea Lord, Sir Arthur Wilson, had famously dismissed submarine warfare as underhand, unfair, and damned un-English, and suggested that captured submarine crews be hanged as pirates. Winston Churchill, as First Lord of the Admiralty, wrote before the war that no civilized power would ever sink merchant ships without providing for the safety of their crews. That last assumption was not merely optimism, it was law. Under the prize rules embedded in the Hague and London declarations, a warship intercepting a merchantman was obliged to stop it, search it, and if it was to be destroyed, put the crew in a place of safety before sinking it. Those rules had been written for cruisers with boarding parties and space below decks. Applied to a submarine with a crew of 30 and no room for prisoners, they were close to unworkable. The question of what a submarine commander should do when the law and his weapon pointed in opposite directions had never been resolved, because no navy had expected to face it. The answer arrived on Zwanzig Oktober 1914, off the Norwegian coast, when Kapitän Leutnant Johannes Feldkirchner in U-17 stopped the British steamer Glitra, bound for Stavanger with a cargo of coal, iron plate, and oil. He obeyed the rules to the letter. He allowed the crew to take to the boats, sent a party aboard to open the sea valves, and towed the lifeboats toward the shore. The Glitra went down in shallow water, the first merchant ship in history sunk by a submarine, and every man aboard survived. 6 days later, the pattern broke. On the 26th of October, Kapitän Leutnant Rudolf Schneider in U-24 fired a torpedo without warning into the French steamer Amiral Gentilhomme in the Channel, believing her to be a troop transport. She was carrying some 2,000 Belgian refugees. She did not sink, but roughly 40 people died in the panic and the rush for the boats. The two incidents, a week apart, mapped out the entire moral and strategic argument of the next 4 years. The escalation followed from the surface war. In November 1914, Britain declared the whole of the North Sea a military area and tightened a distant blockade designed to cut Germany off from the world's markets, including food. Berlin answered on the 4th of February 1915 with a proclamation that from the 18th of that month the waters around the British Isles constituted a war zone in which every enemy merchant vessel would be destroyed without warning, and in which neutral shipping entered at its own risk. It was the first campaign of unrestricted submarine warfare, and it was launched with fewer than 30 operational boats, of which perhaps a third could be at sea at any moment. The tonnage figures were still modest, a little over 1.25 million tons in the whole of 1915, but the political detonation was immediate. It came at 10 past 2 on the afternoon of 7 May 1915, 11 miles off the old head of Kinsale, when Kapitän Lieutenant Walter Schwieger of Utzwanzig fired a single torpedo into the starboard side of the Cunard liner Lusitania. A secondary explosion tore through the forward part of the ship. She listed heavily, and she was gone in 18 minutes. Of nearly 2,000 people aboard, 1,198 died, among them 128 American citizens. The reaction in the United States was immediate and ferocious. President Wilson sent a succession of notes to Berlin so sharp that his own Secretary of State, William Jennings Bryan, resigned rather than sign the third of them. When U-24 sank the liner Arabic in August, killing more Americans, the country until the spring of 1917 on the grounds that merchant masters could not keep station and that convoys merely presented a larger target. That left Germany holding a weapon of extraordinary promise and extraordinary hazard, and by the winter of 1916 the argument in Berlin had narrowed to arithmetic. Admiral Henning von Holzendorf, chief of the Admiralty staff, submitted a memorandum on the 22nd of December 1916 calculating that if U-boats could sink 600,000 tons of shipping a month and frighten off 2/5 of neutral traffic, Britain would be forced to seek terms within 5 months. He had well over 100 boats to do it with, and he closed with a guarantee upon his word as a naval officer that not one American soldier would set foot on the continent. The paradox was total and it was inescapable. Restrained, the submarine could not win the war. Unleashed, it could strangle Britain within a single summer, but only by sinking neutral ships and drowning neutral civilians, which meant summoning into the field the largest untapped industrial power on Earth. Germany had built a weapon that could deliver victory or guarantee defeat, and there was no way to use it that did not risk both. The order took effect at midnight on the 1st of February 1917, and the sea changed overnight. Every ship, neutral or belligerent, armed or unarmed, inside a vast declared zone around the British Isles and across the western Mediterranean, was now a target to be sunk without warning. Germany had roughly 105 boats available, with more commissioning every week, and the men who commanded them no longer had to surface, no longer had to challenge, no longer had to count the lifeboats. The results arrived immediately. February cost the Allies and neutrals some 520,000 tons of shipping. March took over 560,000. Then came April 1917, the worst month in the history of merchant seafaring to that date, when U-boats sank 880,000 tons, more than half of it British. In that single month, 1 out of every 4 merchant ships that sailed from a British port never reached its destination. Holzendorf had promised 600,000 tons a month. His captains were delivering nearly half again as much. The arithmetic of starvation was brutally simple. Britain imported 2/3 of her food, virtually all her oil, and most of the raw materials that fed her war industries. By the middle of April, the country held, by the most alarming Admiralty estimates, something in the order of 6 weeks of wheat, sugar, meat, and fats were already being controlled. The shipbuilding yards were replacing barely 1/5 of the tonnage being destroyed, and the pool of neutral shipping on which Britain depended was evaporating as Scandinavian and Dutch owners simply refused to sail. On the 6th of April, the United States declared war on Germany, exactly as Holzendorf had predicted and exactly as he had insisted would not matter. 3 days later, Rear Admiral William Sims arrived in London and was shown the real figures by the First Sea Lord, Admiral Sir John Jellicoe. Sims said it looked as though the Germans were winning. Jellicoe replied that they would win unless the losses could be stopped, and stopped soon. Asked what the solution was, the first Sea Lord admitted that there was none that he could see. There was one, and it had been sitting in front of the Admiralty for 2 years. Convoy was as old as naval warfare, the practice of gathering merchantmen into a single mass and escorting them with warships, and the Royal Navy had used it for centuries against privateers and frigates. Against submarines, the Admiralty rejected it flatly and repeatedly. The objections were technical and they were sincerely held. Merchant masters, it was argued, were not trained to keep station and would collide with one another in the dark or scatter in a gale. A convoy could move only at the speed of its slowest ship, wasting the capacity of the fast ones. Assembling and dispersing convoys would clog the ports and destroy the flexibility of trade. And above all, senior officers insisted that 40 ships steaming together simply presented a submarine with a 40 times larger target. The Navy's instinct was offensive. It wanted to hunt submarines, patrolling thousands of square miles of empty water with trawlers and destroyers, and in 1917 that instinct was killing the merchant fleet. Patrolled sea lanes were vast. The U-boat only had to wait in them for the next lone steamer to come plodding over the horizon on a predictable course. What broke the deadlock was statistics. The Admiralty had justified its refusal by claiming that some 2,500 merchant vessels entered and left British ports every week, a volume no escort force on Earth could shepherd. In April, a young officer at the Ministry of Shipping's anti-submarine division, Commander Reginald Henderson, working with the shipping controller's staff, examined the underlying returns and found the figure was an accounting fiction. It counted coasters, ferries, cross-channel packets, and vessels of a few hundred tons. The number of genuine ocean-going arrivals from beyond the war zone was between 120 and 140 a week. That was not an impossible task. It was a manageable one. Henderson's figures reached Lloyd George through the cabinet secretary, Maurice Hankey, and the Prime Minister, who had already lost patience, went to the Admiralty in person on the last day of April. By then, the evidence had also arrived from the sea. The French coal trade across the Channel, reorganized into escorted controlled sailings from February, had seen its losses collapse. The Scandinavian ore and timber traffic, convoyed from late April on Beatty's insistence, showed the same result. The first experimental ocean convoy sailed from Gibraltar on the 10th of May 1917, 16 ships escorted by 2 sloops and a handful of armed yachts, and it arrived in British waters 10 days later without losing a single vessel or, to the surprise of the skeptics, breaking formation. On the 24th of May, the first transatlantic convoy left Hampton Roads in Virginia. 12 ships bound for the United Kingdom met at the edge of the danger zone by destroyers from Queenstown. It too came through. By August, the system was being extended to the whole deep-sea trade in and out of the British Isles, and by the autumn, homeward and outbound convoys were running on fixed cycles from Halifax, Sydney, New York, Hampton Roads, Dakar, and Gibraltar. The escorts came in large part from the United States Navy. 6 American destroyers under Commander Joseph Taussig had reached Queenstown on the 4th of May, and by the end of the year there were more than 30 working under Royal Navy operational control in the western approaches. The tactical effect was immediate, and it was decisive, though not for the reasons the Admiralty had feared. A convoy did not simply concentrate targets. It emptied the ocean. Instead of a steady procession of single ships spread across every shipping lane, the sea was now largely bare, with the traffic compressed into a few dozen dense groups that a submerged submarine, with its 4 or 5 knots underwater and its low periscope horizon, was extremely unlikely to blunder across. When a U-boat did find a convoy, it faced a screen of escorts, a zigzagging mass of ships that gave it only minutes for a single submerged attack, and a hail of depth charges the moment it fired. The weapons were still crude. Direct 15,000 Allied merchant seamen at a cost of 178 boats and roughly 5,000 submariners. They had come nearer to defeating Britain than the entire German battle fleet. They had also failed, and the reason was written plainly in the shipping returns for anyone in the next generation who cared to read them. The Treaty of Versailles was blunt on the subject. Article 191 declared that the construction and acquisition of any submarine, even for commercial purposes, was forbidden to Germany. The surrendered boats at Harwich were parceled out among the victors, some broken up, some studied down to the last valve, a handful sold for scrap on English beaches where sightseers paid to walk their decks. The great yards at Kiel and Danzig and Bremen were stripped of their submarine work. On paper, the weapon that had nearly severed Britain's arteries had been legislated out of existence in the country that built it. Britain wanted more than that. At the Washington Naval Conference in the winter of 1921 and 1922, the British delegation argued for the outright abolition of the submarine as an instrument of war, and the American delegate Elihu Root proposed a resolution binding submarines to the old prize rules, requiring them to stop, search, and provide for the safety of a merchant crew before sinking. The resolution was drafted and signed. It never came into force because France refused to ratify, and France refused for a simple reason. The French Navy had watched a handful of cheap boats paralyze the world's greatest fleet, and it had no intention of surrendering the cheapest lever available to a second-rank naval power. Washington capped battleships and aircraft carriers in precise tonnage ratios and left submarines essentially unrestricted. The one weapon that had come closest to deciding the war was the one weapon the treaty system could not bring under control. The London Naval Treaty of 1930 tried again and achieved a partial result. Britain, the United States, and Japan each accepted a ceiling of 52,700 tons of submarines, with no individual boat above 2,000 tons or carrying guns heavier than 5.1 inches. France and Italy declined to accept the submarine articles at all. What all the signatories did accept was Article 22, the restatement of prize rules, later reissued as the London Protocol of 1936 and signed in due course by Germany. It read well. It obliged a submarine commander to place passengers and crew in a place of safety before sinking a merchantman, and it specified that ships' boats did not count as a place of safety unless land or another vessel was close at hand. Every naval staff that read it understood that in a general war it would last about as long as the first serious convoy battle. Britain nonetheless built a great deal of its planning on the assumption that the rules would hold. While the diplomats drafted, German submarine engineering quietly emigrated. In 1922, the three yards with the deepest submarine experience, Krupp's, Germania Werft, Vulcan, and Weser, jointly founded a design bureau in the Netherlands called the Ingenieurskantoor voor Scheepsbouw in The Hague. It was staffed largely by German engineers, financed through cover companies with innocuous names, and it existed to keep an unbroken line of submarine design work alive on foreign soil. Its output was not theoretical. IVUs drew and sold boats abroad, and it used the customers as laboratories. 3 submarines built to its designs went to Turkey in the late 1920s. A boat laid down at Cadiz in Spain, designated E1, was completed in 1931, trialed with German crews in the Mediterranean, and eventually sold to Turkey as the Gur. Her lines became the basis of the German Type 1. In Finland, the Veitahinen class was built to IVS drawings, and in 1933 a small prototype known as CV-707 was launched at Turku, tested by German officers on Finnish lakes, and later commissioned into the Finnish Navy as Vesico. She was, in every important respect, the German Type II. Inside Germany, the same discipline was applied to personnel. A section of the Naval Command quietly retained submarine specialists under other titles. Torpedo development continued at Eckernförde. Officers were sent to sea in foreign submarines under commercial cover. In 1932, before Hitler took power, the Reichsmarine had already drafted a construction program that included 16 boats. In 1933, an establishment opened at Kiel under the name Unterseebootsabwehrschule, the anti-submarine defense school, a title chosen because defense against submarines was not forbidden. It trained submarine crews. By 1934, parts and sections for small coastal boats were being fabricated and stored in sheds so that assembly could begin the moment political cover existed. Germany did not rebuild its U-boat arm from nothing in the late 1930s. It preserved the arm through the 1920s and simply waited. The cover arrived on the 18th of June 1935 in the form of the Anglo-German Naval Agreement. Britain, seeking to bind German rearmament into a manageable framework, conceded a German fleet of 35% of Commonwealth tonnage and in submarines conceded 45%, with an explicit right for Germany to build to full parity if it notified London first. It was a remarkable document. The power that had campaigned at Washington for the abolition of the submarine had just granted Germany by treaty the legal right to build as many submarines as the Royal Navy possessed. 11 days later, on the 29th of June, U-1 was commissioned at Kiel. By the end of September, the first flotilla was in service, named after Otto Weddigen, and its commander was the officer who had been blown to the surface off Sicily in 1918 and had spent his captivity thinking about massed attack. Karl Dönitz was appointed Führer der Unterseeboote, and he set about turning a theory into a doctrine. Britain, meanwhile, believed it had already solved the problem. Work begun in 1917 by the Anti-Submarine Division and pushed forward by the Canadian physicist Robert Boyle had produced a practical quartz transducer capable of sending a sound pulse into the water and timing its echo. The device took its name from the committee that sponsored it, and by the early 1920s, ASDIC sets were being fitted to destroyers, first experimentally, then as standard. Under good conditions, a trained operator could hold a submerged submarine at 1,500 yards or more and pass the bearing to the bridge, and the destroyer could run in and lay a pattern of depth charges. In fleet exercises through the 1920s and 1930s, the results were consistently encouraging. Submarines were found, tracked, and theoretically destroyed. In 1937, the Admiralty recorded its considered judgment that the submarine would never again be able to present Britain with the problem it had faced in 1917. That judgment rested on assumptions that were never seriously tested. As the IZ searched a narrow arc and demanded slow, methodical sweeps, which meant a screen could be saturated by numbers, it lost contact at close range as the attacking ship passed over its target, so the final seconds of every attack were blind. It gave bearing and range but not depth, so Lemp had convinced himself on a darkening horizon and a zigzag course that he was looking at an armed merchant cruiser. Realizing his error, he said nothing on the radio, and later his log was quietly altered. Berlin denied everything and eventually suggested that Churchill had sunk the ship himself to bring America into the war. None of the diplomatic noise changed the essential fact. On the first night of the Second World War, the Atlantic campaign had resumed precisely where it had ended in 1918. The opening weeks confirmed it. In September 1939 alone, the U-boats sank 41 merchant ships, and they did not confine themselves to merchantmen. On the 17th of September, southwest of Ireland, Otto Schuhart in U-29 found the aircraft carrier Courageous steaming with 2 destroyers on an anti-submarine sweep, close to under 3,000 yards, and fired 3 torpedoes. 2 struck. The carrier capsized in about 20 minutes and took 519 men down with her, and the Admiralty abruptly abandoned the idea of hunting submarines with capital ships. 4 weeks later, on the night of the 14th of October, Gunther Prien took U-47 through the shallow eastern channel at Kirk Sound and into Scapa Flow itself, torpedoed the battleship Royal Oak at anchor, and escaped to the open sea. 833 officers and men died in the fleet's own base. Prien returned to a hero's welcome in Berlin, and the Royal Navy learned in the space of a month that its 1937 judgment about the harmlessness of submarines had been written in ignorance. Britain, to its credit, did not repeat the argument of 1917. Convoy was instituted within days of the outbreak, not after 2 years of slaughter, but the system that existed on paper was thin in the water. Escorts sailed with outbound convoys only as far as about 15 degrees west, then turned back to collect an inbound group, leaving the merchant ships to disperse and steam on alone. There were nowhere near enough escort vessels, and the ships being hurried into service, the small Flower-class corvettes built to a whale-catcher design, were wet, cramped, slow enough to be outrun by a surfaced U-boat, and initially fitted with neither radar nor direction-finding gear. The whole apparatus had been designed around a specific mental picture: one submerged submarine, stalking a convoy at periscope depth by day, located by ASDIC and destroyed by a methodical depth charge attack. That picture was about to be dismantled. Dönitz had done the arithmetic years before. A convoy of 40 ships arranged in 9 columns presented an enormous target, but it was screened, and a single U-boat attacking it could fire 4 bow tubes, sink perhaps 2 ships, and then spend hours being hunted while the convoy vanished over the horizon. The defense was strong at the point of contact and weak everywhere else. His answer was to attack everywhere at once. Boats would be strung out across the expected route in a patrol line, 20 or 30 miles apart, sweeping a band of ocean hundreds of miles wide. The first boat to sight smoke would not attack. It became the contact keeper, shadowing from outside the screen, hanging on the convoy's flank, and reporting position, course, and speed by radio while the others were ordered to converge. Only when enough boats had gathered, and only after dark, would they go in together on the surface from several bearings at once. Escorts pursuing one attacker on one quarter opened a hole on another. Every counterattack made the situation worse. The tactic was not a matter of instinct or bravado. It depended on 2 technologies working together. The first was radio. German boats used compressed transmissions, the short signals, to report contact in a few seconds, encrypted on the Enigma machine that both sides' cryptographers would spend the war fighting over. The second was centralized command. Dönitz did not lead his packs at sea. He controlled them from ashore, first at Wilhelmshaven, then at Sengwarden, then from Paris, and from November 1940 from the villa at Kernevel outside Lorient, where a plotting room held the position of every operational boat in the Atlantic on a wall chart. From there he ordered patrol lines, redeployed groups across hundreds of miles, allocated fuel and torpedoes, and decided when a pack was strong enough to strike. His picture of Allied movements was sharpened by the Naval Intelligence Service, the B-Dienst, which was reading British convoy signals with dangerous fluency. It was a system of extraordinary reach for 1940, and it carried the flaw that would eventually help destroy it, because every one of those transmissions was a radio wave that could be intercepted, located and bearing plotted by an enemy who learned how. The first attempts at group operations in October 1939 failed outright. There were simply too few boats, coordination broke down, and several of the first groups were shattered or lost before they could combine. Through the winter, the U-boat arm was diverted into mine-laying, and in the Norwegian campaign of April 1940, its torpedoes betrayed it, the magnetic and contact pistols failing repeatedly against warships at point-blank range, until Dönitz recorded that his crews had been sent against the enemy with a weapon that was practically useless. Then, in June 1940, France collapsed, and everything changed. On the 7th of July, the first U-boat entered Lorient. Within months, Brest, Saint-Nazaire, La Pallice, and Bordeaux were operational bases with concrete shelters rising over the pens. The long, dangerous transit around Scotland disappeared. Patrol endurance on station effectively doubled, and the boats now emerged onto the convoy routes from the flank. The reckoning came in October 1940. Convoy SC-7 35 slow merchantmen left Sydney, Cape Breton on the 5th of October, escorted at first by a single sloop. By the night of the 18th of October, it was in the western approaches, with 3 escorts and a pack forming around it in the darkness. 7 boats went in over 2 nights, Kretschmer in U-990, Schepke in U-100, Endras, Frauenheim, Bleichroth, Meule and Liebe among them. They attacked on the surface inside the columns where ASDIC could not separate a low-grey hull from the merchant ships it was hiding among, and where starshell blinded the very lookouts it was meant to help. 20 of the 35 ships were sunk. Kretschmer, moving coolly between the lines with his deck gun crew closed up, accounted for 6 of them and reloaded twice. The following night, before the escorts could recover, the same command machinery vectored boats onto convoy HX-79, a fast eastbound convoy with a far heavier screen, 2 destroyers, 4 corvettes, 3 trawlers, a minesweeper, and a submarine. 12 more ships went down. Not a single U-boat was damaged. In roughly 48 hours, the Germans had destroyed 32 ships and around 150,000 tons of shipping for no loss whatever. The German crews called the period that followed the happy time. In October 1940, the U-boats sank 63 ships. Across the year, they accounted for well over 2 million tons, and they did it with an average of only 8 or 9 boats on station at any moment, because Plan Z had starved the construction program, and losses in the first year had not been replaced. That the war was piling onto every bridge. The Castle class and the Lock class followed. In the United States, the transformation was industrial rather than incremental. American yards laid down destroyer escorts in numbers that had no precedent in naval history, more than 500 of them, welded rather than riveted, prefabricated in sections and assembled on slipways that had not existed 2 years earlier. 50 of the earliest were handed straight to the Royal Navy as the Captain class. Alongside them, the fleet destroyer programs ran at full stretch. The Fletchers in America and the Emergency War Program destroyers in Britain, while Henry Kaiser's yards poured out the Liberty ships whose cargoes the escorts existed to protect. By 1943, the Allies were building merchant tonnage faster than Dönitz could sink it, and escorts faster than he could build submarines. That single crossing of the graphs was the strategic heart of the entire campaign. Ships, however, were only platforms. What mattered was what they carried, and the weapons of 1939 had been almost embarrassingly crude. The standard depth charge, a drum of amethyl rolled off a stern rail or fired a short distance by a thrower, had to explode within about 20 feet of a pressure hull to rupture it. It sank at roughly 10 feet per second, which meant that a submarine at 200 feet had the better part of half a minute to alter course and depth, while the charges fell. Worse, ASDIC transmitted in a cone that spread downward and outward, so as the escort closed the target, it lost contact in the last critical seconds and had to attack blind across a stretch of water where the U-boat could be anywhere. Captains learned to fire long patterns and hope. The improvements arrived in sequence, each one narrowing the submarine's margin. Heavier charges with cast torpex filling raised lethal radius. Hydrostatic pistols were redesigned to fire at 500 feet and eventually deeper, following the boats down as German commanders learned to dive below the old settings. Cast iron weights clamped to the charge cases increased sinking speed. Then came the answer to the blind moment before the attack: ahead-throwing weapons. The Hedgehog, in service from early 1942, was a spigot mortar that hurled 24 contact-fused bombs in an elliptical pattern some 230 yards ahead of the ship, so the escort could fire while still holding the target in its sonar beam. Because the bombs detonated only on contact, a miss left the water quiet and the contact intact, instead of filling the sea with reverberation that blanked the set for minutes. Hedgehog's early results were poor because crews mistrusted it and aiming demanded precision, but as training improved, its kill rate climbed above that of depth charges. Squid, arriving in 1943, went further, a 3-barreled mortar firing full-size charges that were fused automatically by the depth reading of the sonar itself, a closed loop between detection and destruction. The sonar improved in parallel. The pre-war ASDIC set gave bearing and range but no depth, and it was operated by a rating hand training a dome, while an officer estimated the target's course. The Type 144 set introduced automatic training and a chemical range recorder that plotted the trace so an attack could be worked out geometrically rather than intuitively. Attachments gave a depth-finding beam. Escorts began working in pairs, one holding contact and directing while the other attacked, a technique the Royal Navy's Western Approaches Tactical Unit in Liverpool refined by wargaming convoy battles on a linoleum floor with wrens pushing model ships. Hundreds of officers passed through that building. What they learned there was not technology but method, the creeping attack, the plaster attack, the discipline of not abandoning a contact for hours until the submarine's battery failed and it had to surface or suffocate. Still, none of it mattered if the U-boat attacked on the surface at night, which was precisely what Dönitz had built his tactics around. That advantage was destroyed by a lump of copper. Early metric radar sets could not resolve a conning tower against sea clutter. But in 1940, the cavity magnetron made centimetric transmission practical, and in the spring of 1941, the Type 271 set went to sea in the corvette Orcus. It could detect a surfaced submarine at over a mile, sometimes far more, and its planned position indicator displays gave the bridge a picture rather than a signal strength. Within 18 months, hundreds of escorts carried it. The dark, which had been the U-boat's cover, became the escort's hunting ground, because a submarine on the surface at night was now the only hard radar echo in a wide stretch of empty water. The same revolution came from the air. Aircraft fitted with ASV radar found boats crossing the Bay of Biscay, and from mid-1942 the Lee Light, a 24-inch searchlight slave to the radar bearing, was switched on in the final seconds of the attack run, illuminating a target that had no time to dive. German crews began transiting submerged and surfacing only in daylight when they could see the aircraft coming, which cost them speed, range, and time on station. Beneath all of it ran an invisible campaign. Every element of the wolfpack system depended on radio, sighting reports, homing signals, weather reports, Dönitz's own orders from shore. Each transmission was an opportunity. high-frequency direction finding, small enough by 1942 to be mounted in an escort's masthead, allowed a ship to take a bearing on a U-boat's brief signal and run down it at once, driving the shadower under and breaking the pack before it assembled. Two escorts with the set could fix a position by cross-bearing. Ashore, in the Operational Intelligence Center in London, Roger Wynn's submarine tracking room maintained a plot of every known and inferred boat in the Atlantic, and from 1941 it was fed by Bletchley Park's penetration of the naval enigma, assisted by captures such as the material seized from U-110 in May 1941. Convoys were routed around patrol lines that the Germans believed were secret. When the U-boat service introduced the four-rotor Triton machine in February 1942, Bletchley went blind for 10 months, and the losses of that year reflected precisely. When the key was broken again in December 1942, the plot came back to life. Both sides were reading each other, since German B-Dienst was breaking British convoy ciphers, and the Atlantic became a duel of inference conducted days before any ship came in sight of another. By 1943, these strands had been braided into a single system, and that integration was the decisive development. A convoy no longer traveled as an isolated box of ships hoping to survive. It moved inside a layered defense, a close escort group trained and fought as a permanent team under a commander like Frederick Walker of the 36th Escort Group, a roving support group of destroyers and frigates that could be detached to hunt a contact to exhaustion without stripping the screen. Land-based Very Long-Range Liberators closing the mid-Atlantic air gap from Iceland and Newfoundland, and above all the escort carriers, converted merchant hulls carrying a dozen aircraft that flew continuous patrols around the convoy in weather no shore-based squadron could reach. Detection, direction, air and surface attack now operated as one in tons went down, and the Admiralty later admitted that it doubted whether it could continue to regard the convoy as an effective system of defense. The worst of it came in mid-month, when the eastbound convoys SC-122 and HX-229 converged into the path of more than 40 U-boats and lost 22 ships between them for the destruction of a single submarine. British fuel reserves in the United Kingdom fell to a matter of weeks, and yet within days of that disaster the balance began to tilt, because the tools described in the Washington Convoy Conference of March 1943 were finally arriving in numbers. Escort responsibility in the North Atlantic was rationalized between the British, Canadians, and Americans. Support groups were released for hunting, and the first Very Long-Range Liberators began flying patrols that could reach the center of the ocean. The change appeared first in April. Convoy HX-231, escorted by Commander Peter Gretton's B-7 group, was attacked by a large pack and lost 6 ships, but the escorts and aircraft together sank 2 U-boats and drove the rest off before they could concentrate. It was a modest result on paper and a revolutionary one in practice, because for the first time a convoy under sustained attack in mid-ocean had inflicted proportionate damage while keeping the bulk of its cargo afloat. The system was working. All that remained was for it to be tested against the largest concentration of U-boats ever assembled. That test was Convoy ONS-5, and it became the decisive engagement of the Atlantic War. It sailed westbound from Liverpool on the 21st of April 1943, 43 merchant ships in ballast, screened by Gretton's B-7 group with the destroyer Duncan as senior officer, supported by frigates, corvettes, and, at intervals, by long-range aircraft. Dönitz threw the groups Star, Fink, Amsel, and Specht against it, at times more than 50 boats deployed across its route. For nearly 2 weeks, in appalling weather, gales that scattered the convoy into fragments and forced escorts to break off refueling, The U-boats pressed home attack after attack, and they sank 13 merchant ships. It should have been another SC-107. Instead, in the final nights of the battle, as the first escort group came out from Newfoundland to reinforce, the defense turned on its attackers in fog thick enough to blind the submarines while the escort's centimetric radar saw everything. 6 U-boats were destroyed and many more damaged. The sloop Pelican and the frigate Jed, the corvettes Sunflower, Snowflake, and Loosestrife, and the destroyer Oribe, which rammed U-125 at speed and left her to be finished off in the darkness, killed with coordination that would have been unthinkable 2 years earlier. 13 merchant ships for 6 submarines and a shattered pack was a trade Germany could not afford once, let alone repeatedly. It was repeated within a fortnight. In mid-May, convoy SC-130, again with Gretton in command, was attacked by roughly 24 U-boats and lost not a single merchant vessel, while 5 submarines were destroyed. Among them was U-954, sunk with all hands on the 19th of May by depth charges from the escorts. On board was Oberleutnant zur See Peter Dönitz, the commander-in-chief's younger son. Days later, on the 23rd, rocket-firing swordfish from the escort carrier Archer sank U-752 while covering convoy HX-239, the first submarine destroyed by air-launched rockets. Across the whole of that month, the U-boat arm lost 41 boats, roughly a quarter of its operational strength, for a scale of sinkings that no longer threatened Allied supply at all. On the 24th of May 1943, Dönitz ordered his boats to withdraw from the North Atlantic convoy routes to quieter waters southwest of the Azores. He wrote in his war diary that the enemy's new detection devices had made the wolfpack battle impossible, and he called the situation a temporary sitback. It was not temporary. The submarines never regained control of the convoy lanes. Behind that collapse stood a single geographical fact: the mid-Atlantic air gap, the belt of ocean south of Greenland beyond the reach of land-based aircraft from Newfoundland, Iceland, and Northern Ireland, had been the U-boat's sanctuary. Inside it, boats could shadow on the surface at speed, form up in daylight, and attack without ever being driven under by a patrolling aircraft. It shrank through the spring of 1943 and then closed. Liberators of 120 Squadron flying from Iceland, later joined by squadrons from Newfoundland and Northern Ireland, extended cover to more than 1,000 miles from base, while escort carriers such as Beater, Archer, and the American Bogue brought their own aircraft into the center of the ocean and flew whenever the sea allowed. The effect was immediate and absolute. A pack could no longer assemble unseen. A shadower could no longer keep contact. Air cover did not simply sink U-boats, though it sank many. It broke the tactical mechanism on which every wolfpack attack depended. Germany's deeper wound was human. The men who had made the happy time were already gone, Prien and Schepke dead, and Kretschmer a prisoner since March 1941. Hartenstein killed off Brazil in March 1943, Luth and a shrinking handful still at sea. Their replacements went into the Atlantic with a few months of Baltic training against an enemy who now possessed centimetric radar, ahead-throwing weapons, high-frequency direction finding, and an air umbrella. Experience could not be manufactured. Germany lost around 240 U-boats in 1943, and with them thousands of trained submariners whose skills existed nowhere in a manual, and every loss thinned the cadre of watch officers and engineers on whom the next generation of commanders depended. Boats went out with crews who had never seen an attack pressed home successfully, and increasingly they did not come back at all. By the second half of 1943, the initiative had inverted completely. Allied support groups no longer waited to be attacked. They went out to find U-boats, sat over a contact for hours or days, and hunted it to exhaustion until its batteries and air were spent. Aircraft patrolled the Bay of Biscay so heavily that the transit from the French bases to the open ocean became the most dangerous phase of a patrol. The submarine, the ambusher that had defined 30 years of naval anxiety, had become the quarry. Dönitz would send his boats back to the convoy routes in the autumn, armed with acoustic torpedoes and new detection gear, still hoping for a technological reprieve. What he found was not the ocean he had left. The return to the convoy routes came in September 1943, and Dönitz staked it on a single device. The T5 Zaunkönig, an acoustic torpedo designed to home on the churning propellers of an escort, was meant to reverse the terms of the battle by killing the hunters before they could close. 21 boats formed the Leuthen Group and struck convoys ONs 18 and ON 202 in the North Atlantic. The commanders reported 12 escorts destroyed. The true figure was 3, along with 6 merchant ships, and a genuine revolution in submarine design: a streamlined hull, triple the battery capacity, a submerged speed of over 17 knots, hydraulic torpedo reloading that allowed 18 torpedoes to be fired in 20 minutes, and the ability to remain submerged for days without surfacing. Prefabricated in sections at inland yards and assembled at Bremen, Hamburg, and Danzig, 118 were completed. Faulty section assembly, bombing of the yards, and chronic shortages meant that only a tiny number ever became operationally fit. U-2511 under Adalbert Schnee sailed on the Seoul Type 21 war patrol, and on the 4th of May 1945, after the ceasefire order had been received, made a dummy attack on the British cruiser Norfolk, close to firing range undetected, and slipped away. The smaller coastal Type 23 made a handful of patrols in British inshore waters from January 1945 and sank a few ships without a single loss to enemy action in the North Sea. The design that might have overturned the Battle of the Atlantic came into the world after the battle had already been decided. The accounting is stark. Germany commissioned about 1,150 U-boats across the war and lost roughly 785 of them. Of some 40,000 men who served in the submarine arm, close to 30,000 died and another 5,000 were taken prisoner. A fatality rate above 70%, the highest sustained loss rate of any substantial military formation in the Second World War. In 1945 alone, the Allies destroyed around 150 boats. When the surrender came on the 8th of May, 156 U-boats gave themselves up and more than 200 were scuttled by their crews under the code word Regenbogen. The victors took a handful for testing and then, in Operation Deadlight, towed 116 surrendered boats into the Atlantic northwest of Ireland through the winter of 1945 and 1946 and sank them by gunfire, torpedo, and aircraft rocket. On the other side of the ledger, Allied and neutral merchant shipping losses to submarines came to roughly 2,800 ships and around 14.5 million tons. Some 36,000 Allied merchant seamen died, more than 30,000 of them from the British Merchant Navy, a service of civilians in which the proportional death rate exceeded that of the Royal Navy itself. Thousands more died in escorts, in aircraft over the ocean, in the water waiting for rescue that in the middle of the Atlantic often could not be sent. Out of that slaughter came a permanent change in how navies thought. Before 1939, anti-submarine warfare had been a specialist branch that senior officers regarded as secondary to the gun line and the battle fleet. After 1945, it was the central problem of maritime strategy. The Soviet Union, which finished the war with a large but obsolete submarine force, absorbed the Type 21 wholesale through captured plans, captured sections at Danzig, and captured engineers, and built the Project 613 Whiskey class in numbers exceeding 215 boats through the 1950s. NATO planners looked at those figures, remembered 1943, and concluded that a third Atlantic battle was not merely possible, but the likely opening act of any European war, since every reinforcement division and every ton of fuel for the defense of Germany would have to cross the same ocean by the same routes. So the wartime toolkit was not dismantled, it was industrialized. The United States drew the Type 1's lessons into the Guppy conversion program, stripping deck guns, streamlining conning towers and doubling battery capacity on its fleet boats, and then into the purpose-built Tang class. Britain took the hydrogen peroxide Walter turbine from U-1407, raised and rebuilt her as HMS Meteorite, and pursued high-speed submerged propulsion until nuclear power made it redundant. Ahead-throwing weapons matured from wartime Squid into the three-barreled Limbo mortar. New warship classes were designed around one mission rather than adapted to it. The Royal Navy's Type 12 Whitby and Rothsey frigates, the austere Type 14 Blackwoods intended for mass production in an emergency, the American Dealey-class destroyer escorts, the Canadian Slorants built specifically for North Atlantic conditions by a navy that had learned those conditions the hard way on the Newfoundland run. Escort carriers gave way to dedicated hunter-killer carrier groups. Airborne search radar, magnetic anomaly detection, sonobuoys, and the acoustic homing torpedo, all direct descendants of 1943 improvisations, became standard equipment. Above all, listening became a permanent global enterprise. The wartime discovery that a submarine's machinery radiates identifiable low-frequency sound over enormous distances through deep ocean channels produced Project Jezebel, and from 1954, the first hydrophone arrays were laid off Eleuthera and along the American East Coast. The system grew into SOCIUS, a network of cabled seabed arrays across the Atlantic and Pacific choke points, watching the Greenland-Iceland United Kingdom gap that had once contained the air gap itself. The successors of Roger Wynn's plotting room in the Admiralty became fused intelligence centers tracking every Soviet hull in real time. The convoy, the escort group, the shore tracking room, and the maritime patrol aircraft, four things invented or perfected between 1917 and 1943, became the permanent skeleton of Western naval planning for the next 45 years. The deeper legacy is a change in what naval power means. For 4 centuries, command of the sea had been measured in capital ships and expressed in fleets that could be counted from a distance. The U-boat campaigns proved that a submerged force too small to fight a fleet action could still throttle a maritime empire, and that the answer lay not in bigger guns but in detection, intelligence, industrial output, and the patient protection of unglamorous convoys. Within a decade of the surrender, the submarine had acquired nuclear propulsion and ballistic missiles and become the ultimate arbiter of strategic power, invisible and unreachable. That transformation began with a torpedo off St. Abb's Head in 1914 and was settled in the grey water south of Greenland in the spring of 1943, where the hunters learned to hunt the hunters, and the ocean stopped being a place where anything could hide for long.